All right, so apparently, for some reason, YouTube has locked my ability to go live. They said that my pro sales presentation has been flagged by somebody for abuse this morning, so I'm going to have to record this and see what happens.
On YouTube?
Yeah, on YouTube. They said that my video this morning was flagged by somebody, so I didn't say anything. It was a student presentation, so I have no idea why they did that. It's what?
It's the old dean. You heard me talking crap on him.
Maybe. So I'm going to record this, and hopefully I will get to post it. If not, I guess I'll have to try to figure out a way to post it on D2L. So can't go live this morning. That sort of sucks. I'm not sure what happened. So we need to talk about international IMC right now. I'm a little off my feet since that happened, so I apologize. So we live in a global...
First time being flagged.
That's the first time I've been flagged, absolutely. We live in a global economy. When I first started teaching here at UCO 20-something odd years ago, I could have said, if you went into certain businesses, you probably are not going to be involved, or not all that involved in international issues and international trade. But that's certainly not the case today. I mean, we live in a global connected society in which everybody relies on everybody else. There's almost no nation that completely is self-sustaining, except for maybe some very small individual sort of pre-historic communities. I don't know if you all have been following the news, but there was a Christian missionary named John Allen Cho from the United States who went to travel to India and then went from India to some islands that they have control over in terms of external control. One of those is called the North Sentinel Island, and it's in the Bay of Bengal, I guess. There's a tribe that lives on the North Sentinel Island that has not been exposed to other cultures. They live completely isolated. The interactions that they've had in the past with people have resulted in those people's deaths. They have killed people that have landed on their island and thrown them back out to sea. They are a protected group of people by the Indian government. According to most of the news sites that I've read, they have what's called an eyes-on, hands-off policy. So they specifically prohibit people from going to the island. What this missionary did was a violation of their law. They protect these people so that they can remain. There were some attempts apparently in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s by anthropologists and archaeologists to go and make contact with them. Those were not radically successful. And they hypothesized that if you did have contact with them, that it could be dangerous to this tribe because they don't have immunity to the various diseases that we have, like tuberculosis, smallpox, influenza, and stuff like that, because they live basically in isolation on this island. But with those sorts of few exceptions, all of us are going to be involved in, obviously, a global economy and global trade. If we just look around the room at the number of things that have come, there's almost nothing in this room that hasn't been manufactured, at least in part, somewhere else. The cell phones that you have are completely manufactured, probably, in China, right? The computers that you are using are largely manufactured in China. Even American automobiles, the average American automobile, if you buy it, used to be that we would think we were going to buy American, we're going to buy a Ford pickup truck. The average automobile that is manufactured, even if it's assembled, so they don't like to say manufactured in the United States, they say assembled in the United States, will cross back across the Mexican, US, and Canadian border 7 times in terms of components and parts before it is completed. And so we obviously live in a global economy. And almost every business, even my own business, relies on aspects of international trade. So I have this small family-run business in Guthrie that some of you know about, that I've talked about before, the Stone Line Inn. We're the first bed and breakfast in Oklahoma. And you think, well, most of our clientele are not international. We don't have a big presence. There's a guest ranch here in Oklahoma called the Island Guest Ranch, and they are booked like 5 years in advance. And almost all of the people that visit the Island Guest Ranch are international tourists. Where do you think they're from? They're from 2 countries, Japan and Germany. They both have this fascination with the American West, and so they come and they go out and they do trail rides and they can do cattle roundups and things like that. And their business is almost exclusively international tourists. We don't do that. We cater primarily to people in the Oklahoma City, Wichita, because Wichita is even more boring than Oklahoma City, and Wichita Falls area, which several years ago they did the worst jobs in America. One of the big business publications that may have been Forbes did like the worst jobs in America, and sort of tongue in cheek, they said the second worst job in America was full-time resident of Wichita Falls, Texas. If you've ever been there, it is kind of a horrible place.
A full-time resident was
the second worst jobs in the country. The first worst job that they listed in the United States at that time, this was about 10 or 15 years ago, was chicken sexer for Tyson Foods. So they determine whether or not little chicks are male or female, and then if they're male, because they don't put on weight as much, they destroy the males and keep the females. So fun things you learn in IMC, right? So, different strategies for foreign markets. Obviously, there are, when we talk about, and in the principles class, if you have any principles, we talk a lot about environmental scanning, and we talk about global environmental scans. So what are sort of the environmental scan issues that we think about in a global economy? Well, language is obviously a big one. The vast majority of business, by the way, what is the language of business? It's English. But that doesn't mean that, there aren't obviously businesses that occur and engage in foreign trade. And so language is a big issue. Culture is obviously a big issue. Regulatory environments become important when we think about international trade, IMC, and marketing. Economic issues, the stages of development in the country in which you wish to target, and then demographic considerations. So, for example, I think we talk about this a lot in my principles class, we've talked about it in here. What stage, if we look at sort of the product life cycle of Coca-Cola, what stage of development is Coca-Cola? And so when we talk about product life cycles, right, we have the sort of the birth or the introductory stage. Generally, that requires a lot of advertising to make people aware of the product. And then there's sort of the growth stage where sales start to take off, people become aware, they start buying the product. And then there's maturity and decline. And some of these obviously have, depending on the type of product, the life cycle can vary considerably. So for example, probably with Coca-Cola, if we have a timeline, when we think of the life cycle, it's going to go something like that, where you got introduction, I think in the late 19th and early 20th century, growth. Where do you think it is now?
steady decline.
I think it's in decline in the United States. So where is it not declining? Countries that are newly industrialized countries that are buying a lot of products because they're not necessarily as health conscious or aware. There's not as many issues with obesity. So I think it's in the decline phase in the United States. Obviously things like, if you remember, probably most of you are too young to remember, there was this fad, there were these stupid little stuffed animals that were stuffed with beans called Beanie Babies that were introduced, and they became very popular, and people were selling them for thousands of dollars at one point in time, depending on, if you had a Princess Diana, which I had a Princess Diana Beanie Baby, I think at one point in time it was worth $5,000.
I actually have two of them.
You have two Princess Diana Beanie,
Yeah.
what are they going for on eBay?
I haven't looked because I'm not gonna sell them yet. Last time I checked, they were like $10,000, and that was like a couple years ago.
Oh, I would probably too low to say, I would just be.
I have one Princess Diana Beanie Baby, but you know, those were like, almost everything with Princess Diana.
Oh, it's not by the.
in a garage sale, and we found out that a couple of them were worth big money.
Big money, yeah.
It says rare first edition Princess Diana Beanie Baby, 44,000.
Oh,
Really?
I'm gonna go home now.
You're just gonna leave at
I'm
this
just
point?
gonna leave.
So obviously these life cycles,
That's
you
like
know,
the
in terms
first
of products, are
one.
gonna be important. One of the things that Coca-Cola does is they have expanded pretty much into other markets, but lots of companies are doing that. One of the things that Apple does is they cannibalize their own products in this country by they release iPhones, right, almost every 2 years, and everybody runs out, at least in theory, and buys the new iPhone. What do they do in terms of the older models of iPhones? Well, they sell them in many instances to markets where those iPhones are still, the latest and greatest things. So demographics, economic, and things like that are obviously important. There are obviously differences in media infrastructure in other places. One of the things that's really interesting is that in actually a lot of third world countries, like Brazil and Argentina, I think is what I read about most recently, their internet infrastructure is actually better than the United States internet infrastructure. And why is that? Because when they came to the internet, they did it through fiber optic. And so they have newer fiber optic and stuff like that in those countries than we do. So differences in media infrastructure are obviously important. And what does this say?
Surprisingly, that's one of the first towns that are going to get fiber optic.
Yeah, but a lot of those third world countries are what were considered third world countries, or newly industrialized countries now, or have better technology infrastructure in some instances. So the political and legal is obviously important regulations, and so one of the examples that I give here is obviously the advertising in pharmaceuticals. It used to be that pharmaceutical companies didn't advertise, but because of the First Amendment in the United States, it's so strong, they have started advertising on TV, and people are now running to their doctors. Historically, what pharmaceutical companies have done is they have relied on a push strategy, where they would send missionary salespeople out to the doctor's office, try to convince them to prescribe whatever it is that they're selling for, the latest and greatest heartburn medication or hair pill or gout remedy. Now they have those, they've reversed it, and they're using a full strategy where they advertise direct to the consumer and say things like, do you have, constant heartburn? Heartburn at, taco night is something you can plan for. That's a commercial I can remember. But pizza day at the, unexpected pizza day at the office is when you can't. So, use Prilosec or whatever. And they're using a pull strategy. Well, that's not allowed in a lot of countries, like most of Western Europe. You can't advertise direct to consumer pharmaceuticals, so you're going to have to rely on different things. So those are examples of how your IMC plan may have to change in the international context. Media advertising are allowed. For example, and another example that I give that you're not allowed. So even if you're allowed to advertise, so you're allowed to advertise, for example, in Germany for McDonald's, although you're not allowed to put children's toys in the Happy Meal, and you're not allowed to advertise to children in Germany, so that's obviously different. But another big difference is, what is the iconic way you know where McDonald's is in the United States? The Golden Arches. They have these signs 50 feet into the air that light up with the Golden Arches, and for years and years and years they said millions and millions served, and then they got to 1 billion and they said billions served, and now they say billions and billions served. And these are sort of images that as you travel across the American landscape, you'll see a lot of. Guess what you don't see in Germany? You don't see big 50-foot signs for the Golden Arches. In the town that I lived in, McDonald's actually chose not to come when I was a foreign exchange student to Zost because they were not even allowed to put Golden Arches on the buildings. They had restrictions in the town that I lived in on signage on the building. The sign had to be, you could put it in the window, but you couldn't basically hang out these shingles. And so McDonald's chose not to go there as a result of that. Also, in some places, there are taxes on advertising that are issues that you have to think about in terms of political. So, global versus localized ad, using a global marketing strategy versus a localized marketing strategy. So global marketing, what you do is you have a common plan for all of the countries in which you intend to compete. Now, where is this going to work really, really well? Well, for example, if your business is solely between the United States and Canada, that strategy might work really well because what is Canada? For all intents and purposes, with the exception of one province. What's that province? What province in Canada is different from the other? Quebec. Why is it different?
They have more French influence, don't they?
They speak French, yeah, and they have more of a French influence. But every place else in Canada, for the most part, if you visited Canada, how many of you visited Canada? Only one person in here is not Canada. Some of your family lives in Canada. What's your impression of Canada from visiting Canada?
I like it. I mean, I don't know anything like about really their government or anything or like that. I just go there, you know.
But I mean,
But I like it though.
culturally, if you go across the border, you know, in Canada from Minnesota, there's not a big difference.
Oh, no, not at all.
They all talk funny.
Yeah.
When we went to Great North Woods, my mother, we went to, I think I told you all this, we went to the Lining Kugel factory, and my mother was trying to get because the woman who was the tour guide said, now we're like Budweiser, we have horses and wagons, and they would pull up here and put the beegs in the wagons. And my mother was like, what? You say, you know, but if you go across to Canada, they have sort of that similar accent that they have in the north. You know, what those people consider themselves Midwesterners in the United States. I don't really consider. I consider them, you know, Northwesterners, but they're culturally, other than Quebec, not that different than the United States. We now import more tomatoes and bell peppers from Canada. They're grown in greenhouses across. They have lots of land in Canada. It's cheap, and they can put these greenhouses in, and they have hothouse tomatoes that they grow in Canada. And so there's not a big difference there. Global advertising is the implementation of a global marketing strategy by using the same basic advertising approach in all markets. And the advantages, obviously, of doing it, if you can do that, are that you get economies of scale. It's cheaper. It's lower cost overall. You don't have to come up with, you know, different ads. You can exploit your ideas, your creative ideas across various countries. It allows you to have a consistent image. Coca-Cola's branding is iconic the world over. You can recognize it. McDonald's is pretty iconic the world over, although they have some restrictions, like I said, in Germany, they don't let you put up billboards. When I was a kid growing up, you would have thought, I was born in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and you would have thought that one of the greatest places on earth must be this place called Klein's Corners. Because every mile, for 75 miles east of Albuquerque, and for 100 and something miles west of Amarillo on I-40, there were these billboards every single mile that said, world famous Klein's Corners travel stop. Saltwater taffy. I mean, you would have thought, and the first time I actually went to Klein's Corners, it was one of the biggest as a kid, because I remember seeing these. We would go out with my grandfather to hunt on the King ranches, because he was friends with Bruce King, who was governor. And there were these signs every single mile. You would have thought that Klein's Corners was Disney World, based on the number of signs. And it's this dumpy little travel stop for any of you who have ever traveled to I-40 and gone to Albuquerque or Santa Fe. They still have the signs up. You know, you can't do that in Germany. They don't let you do that.
Buc-ee's is pretty, Buc-ee's is something else. Yeah.
So, but, you know, you can have a consistent image. Other than they don't let you do that in Germany, McDonald's still uses the golden arches. They still have this consistent image. And it obviously allows for simplified coordination and control of your advertising. The disadvantages, of course, go ahead.
Oh, I didn't know if they, like, if McDonald's ever took them to court, like I know Coke, when they introduced them in Korea, I think it was Korea, they weren't allowed to use some of the syrup, they had to give up the recipe if they were, or India. They had to give up the recipe if they were going to India, and they took them to court, and they had to do that. Would McDonald's ever do that to get into Germany? Or is it the market they let?
You know, I don't think that that's gonna, I mean, suing your way in is not, I mean, first of all, it doesn't work very well. Second, it creates lots of bad will. Third, other countries like, my impression, and I am not a German legal scholar, so I don't really know. I mean, obviously I have a law degree and I practice law here, and I used to teach business law. I don't know what the legal system in Germany is like I mean, I have some general concept of it, but I don't think that they're necessarily as litigious and as willing. Now, what you could say is maybe it's a restriction on trade, and you could try to get your country to take them to the WTO. I don't think that would be terribly effective either. So, the disadvantages obviously of using a global marketing strategy and then a global advertising strategy to go along with that, or a global IMC plan, is that there are cultural differences, huge cultural differences across countries. Assuming that all people are the same is really not necessarily a good thing. There are obviously market differences in terms of what they need. When Tupperware, one of their most popular products in the Tupperware line for years and years and years was a bread box that you put your bread in. What is bread in the United States historically been for a long period of time? How do we buy bread in the US? You buy it in a plastic bag, and what does it look like? It's a loaf, and it's pre-sliced. In the rest of the world, what does bread look like? It's round in most places. So like in India, when they wanted to introduce a bread-saving box, they don't have sliced loaf bread. And so there are cultural differences, market differences, and obviously economic differences. The consumer needs are very different in many instances. When McDonald's decided to go to India, what did they have to have? What don't they eat in India? They don't eat beef. So there are consumer needs that are different. Usage patterns are different. We look at McDonald's as being cheap, fast, consistent. That's what makes McDonald's a success. Big Mac tastes like a Big Mac in New York City, and it tastes the same way in Oklahoma City. You're gonna get a smashed down hamburger that looks nothing like the picture of the hamburger that they put up, right? You're gonna have this smashed down hamburger. It's not gonna look like the picture, but it's gonna taste pretty much like a Big Mac in New York City, and it's gonna look the same in New York City. When McDonald's went into Russia, it's actually considered like fine dining, because at the time that they went in, the Russian economy was so broke, and the vast majority of people made so little money, and it was not worth anything, that it was actually expensive to go there. And so it wasn't like, we just think of going to McDonald's. How many of you have gone to McDonald's in the last month? A few of you have gone to McDonald's. And did you, think much about it, and probably thought, I don't really care if I go there ever again, right? But it's cheap, fast, and consistent. Lack of media availability in places that are developing newly industrialized countries. You may not have the same media availability to advertise. There may not be television in places. There may not be internet. You can have obviously legal restrictions. And using a global strategy can risk alienating your local management, your local employees, and your local customers.
Can you give an example of something like that?
I can give you a big example. One of the people that I went into the PhD program with, before she went into the PhD program, she was a salesperson for a company called Sikorsky Helicopters. They're the helicopters that are sold primarily to I think Donald Trump's helicopter is actually a Sikorsky helicopter. So they market for that sector. They also sell to the government, but they market that sector as being a tool for the busy executive who needs to get where they need to go in a hurry, like Donald Trump, right? Go around New York, avoid the traffic, and get there in a hurry. When they tried to take that campaign and use it, they wanted to market it to very wealthy individuals in South America with largely Hispanic populations in places like Colombia and Argentina. And she was the sales rep that was actually, because her family is originally from Colombia, and she speaks Spanish fluently, she was assigned to that territory. That campaign failed miserably because they don't view things as being in a hurry the way Americans do. And so what might be a bigger selling feature in places like Colombia and Argentina and things like that? Well, I don't know, I have a friend who was on my brother's tennis team at OSU. His name is Shunji, and he's from Brazil, which is not Spanish, it's Portuguese. They speak Portuguese in Brazil, but he's from Brazil. He was a tennis player. His family is enormously wealthy. He's recently moved back to the United States, and he's trying to get his American CPA. He's a lawyer there because he lived in Rio, and apparently it's become so dangerous in Rio that he said when they leave, they have a family compound. He's like, when we leave, when they open the gates, when I take my kids to school, I do not stop. I literally do not stop at stop signs or stop lights. You pause and do and roll through because people will try to open the doors and kidnap your children and hold them ransom. Maybe the way you could market helicopters is safety in those countries. You know, you need to get there safely, use a helicopter. And so, but it did not go over their model of advertising, you know, for the busy executive on the go, just didn't, the translation was all wrong in those countries and in South America. And so it really didn't work, and it was a big failure, and they had to come up with a different marketing plan. So when is a global campaign appropriate? If you can use a brand that can be adapted for consistent visual appeal, things like Coca-Cola, you know, consistent visual appeal. Even though in China they use different characters, you still have what's the Coca-Cola emblem. It's a red with a white sort of stylized thing, right? The script for Coca-Cola is usually the same. It works with brands that play to universal needs, values, or emotions. What would be an example of that? Well, you could probably use similar advertising with different translations for language for things like pharmaceutical sales. Even though you can't advertise direct to consumer in any other nation except New Zealand, you can use similar persuasion with regard to doctors and patients for things like, I don't know, HIV drug cocktails. HIV does not discriminate based on national origin, does it? No. Heart disease doesn't discriminate, things like that. High-tech products or brands that are not deeply rooted in a cultural tradition or value can lend themselves to a global marketing or global campaign. So what are brands that are not deeply rooted in cultural values? Well, things like your cell phones. No deep cultural semblance associated with that. It's just a functional tool, it's technology. Like this mouse, this Logitech mouse, right? Like computers in Germany use things like this, don't they? They're not all like it. A pattern advertising allows you to follow a basic approach, but use local themes, copy, and visual elements. Are people different in other parts of the world? If you're advertising Coca-Cola in Germany, is it different than the United States? What's different about the German population than the United States? Would you guess?
But more structured.
They are more structured. They're also more homogenous, ethnically. Although that's changing, they are a less diverse population. You can have a multi-ad, multi-message approach where you develop a variety of ads and messages, and then you allow local managers to select those that fit local conditions, but that are consistent with the overall brand image that you want to maintain and control. So the decisions that you have to make when you decide to go global, you have to think about the organizational style. Are you gonna have a hierarchical organization? Are you very top-down, or are you more flat? Do you have a local partner? Lots of foreign nations require that you have joint foreign investment or joint local investors in your business. And so that kind of organizational style. What is the ad agency selection process that you're using? Looking at creative strategies and execution for global markets, and then media strategy. Again, in some areas they don't have. If you're relying heavily in the United States, lots of businesses are now relying almost exclusively. My own business is one that we used to advertise very heavily in local papers like the Oklahoman, the Gazette, the Wichita Eagle, the Dallas Morning News, because we got a lot of people from Dallas, things like that. We don't advertise in any magazines or newspapers anymore. We rely almost completely on internet presence to drive our business. If you took that model in other places and you don't have internet, that could be problematic. So the media strategy and selection that you're gonna have to deal with in those areas. In places where they don't have a lot of televisions, they may have radio, and that can be different. So centralized, where you have it directed by headquarters, you have a strong hierarchical presence. Ford Motor Company, for example. It's effective when market conditions are similar from one country to another. So again, if you're selling Ford cars across the United States and Canada, that's not all that big of a difference. There are lots of, if you go to Canada, lots of people still drive pickup trucks in Canada. Why? There's lots of outdoor activity, there's lots of space, there's lots of room. If you go to Germany, what do people not drive a lot of? I mean, it's amazing to me how many people have, if you go through the parking lots of apartment complexes in Oklahoma City and Edmond, how many people drive a Ford F-150? And I just sit there and think, why in the hell are you driving a Ford F-150? What do you need a Ford F-150 for? Huh? Nothing. Yeah, how many of them are going down country roads? I don't see this. But it's because we have the ability, and gas is relatively cheap here, and we have big parking spaces. That's not atypical, that people who have absolutely no need, if you live here in Edmond, the land of the shallow and pretentious, everybody drives an urban assault vehicle, a Cadillac Escalade. Why do you need that? You don't. But you don't see that, again, in places like Western Europe. When I lived in Germany, there's the town that I lived in had tiny little, it was a historic medieval town. And it had this wall around it. And the streets are curvy, and there's no place to park if you drove a Cadillac or a truck or things like that. And so that's a very different market than the American-Canadian market. If the company has just one or a few international advertising agencies, that's a consideration. Do you have standard advertising? And if there's a need for central imaging worldwide, that's where centralization or hierarchical organizations work well. Decentralized allows the decision-making left to local management, and it believes the premise here is that local managers know the local market best. If consistency is less important to the brand, this is appropriate. I would say the vast majority of companies that engage in international relations involve some kind of synthesis model or combination of approaches where you have to get approval from headquarters for your plans, but it may be locally tailored, so a synthesis model. So agency selection, types of agencies. Well, you can have agencies with both domestic and foreign offices. As we said at the beginning of the semester, there has been a movement towards the consolidation of agencies. The vast majority of advertising agencies are in where? In this country, for big accounts, or where? New York and LA on the West Coast. So do you have a big agency with both domestic and foreign offices, or are you using an agency that belongs to a network of international agencies that partner with other agencies, or are you using disparate agencies? One where you have one in the United States that focuses on this, and then you have local agencies that focus on your markets and other nations. So what are the selection criteria? What are the things that you should think about when you think about agency selection, and whether or not you're going to go with a big international or a local or one that has a network? The ability of the agency to cover the relevant markets that you have. So if you're using, for example, there is a company here in Edmond that is a sub-S corporation. They're a multi-million-dollar company. They source products from China. They're called Petra Industries, and I used to have friends that worked for them in human resources at Petra and in sales there. And they actually source a lot of products from China, so they have this presence in China. And they actually do have some international shipping of their products abroad. So they provide a lot of accessories for technical things like monster cables, or computer monitors, things like that. And so if you're relying on a local agency in Oklahoma, they're probably not going to have the ability to cover the relevant markets if you decide that you want to. If you're Petra and you decide you want to go into selling, for example, in Mexico, where you're going to have somebody who can understand and translate languages. The quality of the agency's work, their ability to provide market research. Are they a boutique firm, or can they provide marketing research, public relations, and other services? The relative roles of the company. Do you have a big advertising and marketing department that basically does a lot of the work and then ships out various parts of it to agencies for things like media buying or production? You have to think about the level of communication control between the company and the agency. Does the agency have the ability to coordinate an international campaign? How big is your company's international business? Your desire for local versus an international image. Again, if you have a product like this mouse that's technological, that doesn't have any cultural meaning, versus if you are dealing in products that are largely culturally specific. What's different, for example, there are lots of manufacturers that manufacture clothing for multiple countries and multiple markets, but what are some of the differences that you can face in that? What are some of the differences, even if you think about not just international, but regional differences between, for example, the dress in Oklahoma versus the dress. So let's think about a jean manufacturer. Who manufactures probably the largest number of jeans? Levi's. Wrangler's a huge producer of them as well, but in terms of international, Levi is probably more. So what are the differences between Levi's, for example, and even Oklahoma, and the styles that are popular here in, say, New York? Holes? Like? Yeah, in certain parts of Oklahoma, skinny jean equals communist plot. Right? That would be like with me. I'm wearing my boots today as an example of this. So boot cut versus, tapered legs, things like that. And so, what is your desire? What?
So y'all don't want to see me in boot cut.
Why not?
It just looks funny.
I
I just have really skinny legs, so it's like, I put boot cut jeans on, and they're like,
buy yourself some boots.
I've got some at the house.
Then they won't.
Well, they don't come out ever, really.
The boots don't come out.
If they do come out, my jeans are, I just tuck them right in, and just slip them on, and do whatever I've got to do.
Okay.
He's like,
I'm horrified by that prospect. So, anyway, international image versus local. Obviously, there are differences. The company's organization structure and international business and marketing. Do you have a hierarchical, again, are you partners? For example, Ford partners with a lot of other auto manufacturers in manufacturing cars. And so is that a partnership? Things like that are going to be important. And the company's level of involvement with their international operations. Are you basically controlling everything from your headquarters at Ford in Dearborn, Michigan? Or are you basically a company that allows a great deal of autonomy by your local strategic business units? So media selection, differences in types of media available. Obviously, again, like I said, in Germany, there just isn't a lot of outdoor advertising. They just don't let you do it. That's critical for a lot of businesses, even ones that want to engage in international trade. McDonald's, obviously, one of the things that they have done, why have they expanded into other markets? Why has McDonald's gone overseas? Well, because where is McDonald's again in terms of their life cycle in the United States probably? They're attempting to reposition themselves in the market. So if you look at what McDonald's was even 15 years ago or 10 years ago versus what it is today, they're attempting to, one of their most profitable segments in the, and they no longer like the term fast food, I guess. They view that as being a pejorative, so what do they want to be called? Now, what's that industry like to be called? Anybody know? Quick service is what they like. Yeah, that's the new, that's the politically correct term for what McDonald's is. It's fast food. But they were losing out in their breakfast segment particularly, and that's one of their most profitable segments, is the breakfast market. So what has McDonald's done? McDonald's had really bad coffee for a long time. They've upped their game in their coffee. You can now get this sort of similar selection between them and Starbucks. And their buildings are starting to look more like a Starbucks, right? But in spite of that, and in spite of that attempt to reposition themselves in the market, I think that for a lot of people, that industry is in decline, as we are recognizing that it's not terribly healthy choices and that we probably ought to do something else. And so they naturally want to expand into international markets, and they have. They've done that. The media selection, you cannot do a lot of billboard. How do you know where McDonald's is in the United States? If you're traveling across country on I-40 or I-35, what do? You look for the billboard that says McDonald's exit 125, 5 miles ahead. Yeah.
What if they just make a gluten-free McDouble?
Would that help?
The world would buy it.
As long as the cows were cage free.
It's true.
They weren't fenced in.
Free roam, free ranging cattle.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, that's obviously a difference. They can't do that. They can't have the big billboards in a lot of places in Western Europe. They just won't let them doing that. Varying time spent watching TV, the TV patterns, if you're relying on television commercials, what are the times spent? It was my experience, I don't know if this is still true because I was a foreign exchange student a long time. I've been here for 20-something years teaching at UCO, so you can do the math and figure out that, when I was in high school, that was a long, long time ago. The Germans just didn't watch as much television as we do in the United States. They just didn't do that. They had a television. They had one television in the household that I lived in, and that was pretty much it. One TV. In my household, there's a television in every room. My mother thinks that life doesn't go on without the TV on, without MSNBC blaring constantly in the background.
Do you think it's like continuing to increase, or do you think it's increasing a little bit?
I
don't
think
ever watch
television-
TV.
I think television coverage among your generation is decreasing.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And a lot, and it's becoming more selective. It's not just on and you watch whatever.
I was kind of thinking, I was over at my girlfriend's house the other night, or last night actually, and her dad was in the room watching like The Voice, and he had DVR'd it the night beforehand. And it was kind of funny because he was like, "I'm the boss of the TV," just saying something weird, and I was like, I never looked at it that way, but it's probably like, if you go to work all day and you have a boss that you're listening to, like, getting orders from. It's kind of like pleasing to be able to have a DVR and just sit there and do what you want whenever you want to do it. From a different aspect, it's probably, but it's kind of probably why it's been so popular for that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's.
But it's kind of funny, he was like, I'm the boss of the TV, and I was in the kitchen like making some dinner or something, but it's kind of funny to hear it.
And I think you're right. Yeah, I mean, you're getting your information, you're constantly on that. Even when you're watching TV, you're on your, and I do that. I'm, even if I'm watching news or whatever, I'm still looking at my phone.
Yeah.
and trying
I
to-
just watch ridiculousness.
So the amount of commercial time available, we have an enormous amount of commercial airtime available in the United States. They sell a lot. They don't necessarily in other places. Looking at the clutter, what is the culture's tolerance for advertising? How do they view advertising? Your generation, for example, one of the things that we know, because you come from a generation that has so much information access to you, that you're skeptical of advertising. So what is the tolerance for advertising? That's not necessarily true in other places where the development is not as advanced as the United States. And so their tolerance for and their acceptance of advertising may be different. What's the coverage cost, the quantity and restrictions? Again, things like, can you advertise direct to consumer pharmaceuticals? You can't in most of the world. You can't even advertise things like the toys in the Happy Meal because, they've got some communist plot in Germany against McDonald's.
So you bring that up a lot, so is it a good thing or a bad thing that pharmacies, medicine advertises straight to the consumer?
I think there are both advantages and disadvantages to it. One of the things that I think is a big advantage to direct consumer advertising is that, first of all, a number of conditions that have historically been seen as being problematic from a social perspective have been brought into the light as a result of direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising. And I'll give you an example. When my father went into the Federal Bureau of Investigations, he went in under J. Edgar Hoover. He's 84 now, so a long time ago. You had to meet the director. At that point in time, if you applied, they did a thorough background investigation. They still do a background investigation on everybody. But there were certain things that were an a priori bar to employment with the FBI. And the bar for a special agent, so there was like the people that work at the FBI, you couldn't do these things if you were considered susceptible to compromise. And then for an agent, the bar was even higher. And so one of the things that they do is they would give you a psych evaluation when you went to the FBI, but if you yourself had ever seen a psychiatrist outside of the agency, that was considered an a priori bar to being employed at the FBI, because you were viewed as, if you had seen a psychiatrist, ooh, you have mental issues, you're crazy. We now recognize, as a result of the fact that people have talked about this, and pharmaceutical companies have brought this into the light of day, that depression is something that most people deal with. And that it's a normal part of life, and that seeing somebody and talking about that or seeking treatment for that does not mean that you are crazy. It does not mean that you are mentally defective, and it does not mean that you cannot, that you cannot be a good and valuable employee in places like the FBI. And so I think direct-to-consumer advertising has allowed us to have that conversation openly and honestly, as people have seen people in advertisements that look remarkably like them, that are suffering from depression, right? Now, the bad part about that is, in my opinion, that I think what happens is, I think when your dog dies, you have a tendency to get sad and run to the doctor and say, I need Prozac. That's a normal human emotion. I mean, like, if you have, like, you're gonna be sad sometimes. And you probably don't need Prozac, or Zoloft, or Thorazine, or Xanax to get through that. That's just something you need to work through. If it is a year-long thing and you can't get off the couch, you need to go see a doctor. But I think what we've done is we have started talking about these things, and I think that's good from that perspective. But I think it's also bad that we now think that there is a pill that will cure every single thing. You see a lot of advertising for Prilosec and all of these heartburn. Well, I can tell you as somebody who's 45 years old, when I was in my 20s, I had a stomach of steel and I could eat anything and not be sick and not have heartburn, and I could eat right before I went to bed, go to bed, be perfectly fine. That's no longer the case. If I eat anything, you know, like 2 hours before I go to bed, I've got horrible heartburn. Well, maybe the solution is not to run out and tell your doctor, I need a stronger XYZ pill. The solution is, like, you need to slow down and not eat everything that doesn't eat you first. Right? So I think that there's both good and bad on that. The other thing that I think has been good about it overall, though, is it has changed the balance of power as well. In terms of, it used to be that you go to the doctor and the attitude was doctor knows best. And maybe doctor didn't know that. I mean, and people would accept, you know, they would say things like, there was a movie with Tom Hanks years and years and years ago called Joe versus the Volcano, where he goes to this doctor and the doctor says, you've got a brain cloud and you're gonna die. And then this company has, of course, used this doctor to convince him that he's gonna die, so he'll go sacrifice himself to this volcano so that they can get this stuff through the trial. That was not atypical at that point in time. Even when I was growing up, you went to a doctor and the doctor said this was what was gonna happen. And now, as a result of direct consumer advertising of these things, people go in and say, when the doctor says, you know, Peggy on the CTCA Act, right? You're gonna die, Peggy. That's what her initial doctor told her. And she said, I went to CTCA and they said, you're not gonna die, Peggy. And I'm still here. Well, I got news for you, Peggy. You're gonna die. Probably of this. It's just how long. But she might have been dead a lot sooner if she had just accepted that and hadn't seen the advertisements for CTC. So I think that's a good thing. The stability of the political climate is obviously important in Mother Russia. If they don't like you, they can shut down your advertising because they control the companies, right? And the limited and unreliable media that may be available, media information. So those are all issues when you think about a global perspective and the levels of economic development that you're going into. Any questions about international? All right, well, we will have the next exam on Tuesday, and then we'll listen to your presentations on Thursday. Good deal. And hopefully YouTube will let me upload this video.
And I wonder what for. Will it say what for?